They say a barren woman in Puritan America was worse than a thief, worse than a liar, worse than anything except maybe a witch, and Grace Ashford was about to discover that the woman calling her barren was hiding a sin so dark it would shake their God-fearing village to its very foundations. Before we continue, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Don't just watch quietly, drop a comment below and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in, and let's begin. The year was 1683, and in the frostbitten settlement of Providence Falls, Massachusetts, your worth as a woman could be measured in one simple calculation: how many cradles you filled. Grace had been married to Samuel Ashford for 3 long years, and her cradle remained empty. Every Sunday, she'd sit in that cold meeting house, the wooden pews hard as judgment itself, listening to sermons about how God blessed the righteous with children and cursed the sinful with barrenness. And every Sunday, she could feel the eyes. The whispers. The cold, creeping certainty that the entire village had already decided what she was. What she wasn't. But the worst eyes, the cruelest whispers, came from inside her own home. Constance Ashford, her mother-in-law, had made it her holy mission to remind Grace of her failure at every possible opportunity. You see, Constance wasn't just any village woman. She was the pillar of Providence Falls society, the woman other wives looked to for guidance, the first to arrive at church and the last to leave, her Bible worn soft from constant reading, her prayers loud enough for God and everyone else to hear. When Constance spoke about righteousness and sin, people listened. When she spoke about grace, they listened even harder. It started small, as these things always do. A comment here about how a woman's duty is to her husband's lineage. A side there about empty nurseries and disappointed expectations. But as month followed barren month, Constance's patience wore thin as communion wafer. At community gatherings, she'd position herself near clusters of gossiping women and speak just loud enough for Grace to hear from across the room. 3 years, she'd say, shaking her head with practiced sorrow, and still no sign of God's blessing. Makes you wonder what sins might be hiding in a woman's heart, doesn't it? The other women would nod knowingly, their eyes cutting to Grace like knives wrapped in prayer shawls. Samuel, caught between his mother and his wife, chose the path most men choose when faced with impossible situations. He chose nothing. He retreated into his work, into silence, into the comfortable distance that let him avoid taking any side at all. At night, he'd lie beside Grace in their bed, the space between them growing wider than any physical distance, and Grace knew that his mother's words were seeping into his mind like poison into a well. She could see it in the way he looked at her, or rather, the way he'd stopped looking at her. As if she'd already become invisible, already been erased from the story of his life. The breaking point came on a bitter November evening when the community gathered for a harvest celebration, though God knows the harvest had been poor enough to make celebration feel like blasphemy. Grace stood near the fire, trying to warm hands that felt like they'd never be warm again, when she heard Constance's voice rise above the crackling flames. "A barren tree bears no fruit and deserves no place in the orchard," she announced to a circle of nodding women. "Perhaps it's time to consider that some marriages are simply not blessed, and a man should not be punished for a woman's failings." Grace's blood ran cold. Everyone knew what that meant. In their world, a man could set aside a barren wife. Not easily, but it could be done. And Constance was planting seeds, preparing the ground for Grace's complete destruction. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. The humiliation burned in her chest like hot coals, but something else burned there too. Anger. Pure, righteous anger at the injustice of being judged by a woman who stood so high and mighty, as if she herself were carved from marble and placed on a pedestal by God's own hand. Around midnight, unable to bear the suffocating darkness of her room any longer, Grace wrapped herself in her heaviest shawl and crept downstairs, thinking she'd fetch water from the well, maybe let the freezing air shock some sense into her racing thoughts. The night was crystalline with cold, the kind of cold that makes your breath hang in the air like visible prayers. Grace made her way to the well behind the main house, and that's when she heard them. Voices. Low and urgent, coming from the woods that bordered the village church. At first, she thought it might be young lovers, foolish enough to brave the cold and the ever-watchful eyes of the community. But as she moved closer, drawn by curiosity she couldn't quite explain, she recognized one of the voices. It was Constance. Grace's heart hammered in her chest. What was her mother-in-law doing in the woods after midnight? And who was she talking to? Grace moved like a shadow between the trees, her feet finding the quiet places where fallen leaves wouldn't crunch and betray her presence. The voices grew clearer, and then she saw them. Through a gap in the bare branches, illuminated by the thin light of a cloud-covered moon, Grace witnessed something that would change everything. Constance Ashford, the village's most pious woman, the keeper of moral standards, the judge of Grace's very soul, was wrapped in the arms of a man. But not just any man. Pastor Elijah Goodwin. The spiritual leader of Providence Falls. The man who preached about adultery from his pulpit every Sunday. The man who spoke about the sanctity of marriage and the punishment awaiting those who strayed from righteousness. His hands were tangled in Constance's hair, her face tilted up to his, and even from her hidden vantage point, Grace could see the desperate passion in their embrace. The world tilted on its axis. Grace pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from making a sound, her mind reeling with the impossibility of what her eyes were showing her. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be the same Constance who quoted scripture at breakfast, who led prayer circles, who had spent 3 years destroying Grace's reputation over her inability to conceive. And yet here she was, committing the very sin she condemned in others, wrapped in the arms of the man who was supposed to be saving their souls. Grace watched, transfixed with horror and something else, something that felt dangerously close to power, as Constance and Pastor Goodwin whispered to each other with the familiarity of long practice. This wasn't their first meeting. The way they moved together, the ease of their secret communion, told Grace that this affair had been happening for a long time. Maybe years. Maybe even before Grace had married into the Ashford family. She watched until they finally separated, Constance slipping back toward her house through a different path, the pastor disappearing toward the parsonage, both of them experts at sneaking through the darkness. Grace stood alone in the freezing woods, her entire body shaking, though whether from cold or shock she couldn't say. Her first instinct was to scream, to run back to the house and wake everyone, to expose this hypocrisy to the harsh light of truth. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the memory of all those Sundays watching people be judged and punished, the public confessions and humiliations, the stocks in the village square where sinners were left for days while the righteous threw rotten vegetables and worse. Grace knew how this world worked. The person who spoke first wasn't always the person who was believed. And Constance had something Grace didn't have, the community's trust. Their respect. Their unshakable belief in her righteousness. If Grace spoke now, who would believe her? The barren wife, already suspected of hiding sins, accusing the most pious woman in the village of adultery with their beloved pastor? They'd call her mad. They'd say she was jealous, bitter, desperate to deflect attention from her own failings. They might even call it witchcraft, the planting of false visions in innocent minds. Grace had seen what happened to women who made accusations they couldn't prove. She'd seen them examined, questioned, sometimes worse. No, if she was going to use this knowledge, she needed to be smart. She needed to be strategic. She needed to wait for the perfect moment. Grace made her way back to her room, climbed into bed beside her sleeping husband, and for the first time in 3 years, she smiled in the darkness. Because she finally understood something crucial. The shame she'd been carrying, the weight of all those judgmental eyes and cruel whispers, none of it was about truth. It was about power. Constance had power, so her words became truth. Grace had no power, so her very existence became a sin. But now Grace had something. She had knowledge. She had a secret that could destroy the woman who'd been trying to destroy her. And then, as if God himself had been watching this entire chess game and decided to make his move, Grace discovered something exactly 2 weeks later that would change everything. She was pregnant. The question that haunts every righteous community, every place where judgment flows like water and forgiveness comes drop by precious drop, is this: what happens when the judges are the ones who need judgment? What happens when the woman who called you barren, who questioned your worth, who tried to erase you from your own life, is hiding a sin so profound it makes your supposed failings look like dust motes in sunlight? Grace Ashford was about to find out, and the answer would tear Providence Falls apart at its hypocritical seams. But would exposing the truth give Grace back her dignity, or would it cost her everything she had left? Grace placed her hand on her still flat stomach and made a decision that would either save her or destroy her completely. She would become a hunter, and Constance Ashford would never see the trap closing until it was far too late. You have to understand something about survival in a place like Providence Falls. It wasn't the strong who survived, it was the quiet ones, the watchers, the women who learned to move through the world like smoke, seeing everything while appearing to see nothing at all. And Grace had just enrolled herself in the most dangerous game of observation she could possibly play. Because now she wasn't just watching Constance and Pastor Goodwin to confirm what she'd seen that frozen night in the woods. She was documenting, memorizing, building a case that would one day stand against the two most powerful people in her world. The pregnancy changed everything and nothing all at once. When Grace announced the news, the village erupted in celebration, as if her womb's suddenly opening was proof that God had finally forgiven whatever invisible sin they'd all decided she'd committed. Women who'd whispered about her for 3 years now embraced her, speaking about miracles and answered prayers. Samuel seemed to walk taller, his mother's poison temporarily neutralized by this evidence of his virility. And Constance, oh, Constance played her part beautifully. She smiled. She congratulated. She thanked God loudly in front of witnesses. But Grace saw something else flickering behind those pious eyes. Relief, yes, but also something darker. Something that looked almost like fear. Because a pregnant Grace was a Grace with value, with purpose, with a voice that people might actually start listening to. And that was dangerous for a woman with secrets. What Grace discovered in those early months of pregnancy was that being with child gave her a kind of armor she'd never possessed before. Suddenly, she could speak at dinner without Samuel cutting her off. She could make decisions about the household without Constance immediately overruling her. It was subtle, this shift in power, but Grace felt it like a blind woman suddenly gaining sight. And she used every ounce of it to position herself exactly where she needed to be. At church, she made sure to sit where she could watch both Constance and Pastor Goodwin. During community gatherings, she volunteered for duties that kept her near the woods, near the church, near the places where secrets were kept. She became invisible again, but this time by choice. This time with purpose. And what she saw confirmed everything and worse. The affair wasn't just ongoing, it was elaborate. Constance had constructed an entire architecture of deception, using church volunteer work as her cover. Every Tuesday, she helped organize the parish records. Every Thursday, she cleaned the meeting house. Every Saturday, she prepared materials for Sunday service. And every single one of those days, Pastor Goodwin was there, alone, waiting. Grace watched from shadows and windows, from the woods and from careful distances, and she saw the pattern clear as scripture. They'd been doing this for so long they'd gotten comfortable. Sloppy. The way Pastor Goodwin's hand would linger on Constance's arm a moment too long after service. The way Constance's eyes would find him in every crowd, a split second of naked longing before she remembered to arrange her face back into righteous concern. Grace collected these moments like coins, saving them for a purchase she hadn't quite figured out how to make yet. But here's where the story gets truly twisted, because Constance, feeling that shift in power, decided she needed to reassert her dominance before it was lost forever. One evening, about 4 months into Grace's pregnancy, when Samuel was away on business and Thomas had retired early, Constance cornered Grace in the kitchen. The older woman's face was arranged in that expression of concern that Grace had learned to recognize as a prelude to cruelty. "I've been hearing things," Constance said, her voice soft as a knife sliding between ribs, "whispers about the child you carry. Some in the village wonder if perhaps the timing is too convenient. If perhaps Samuel isn't the only man you've been welcoming into your bed." Grace's blood turned to ice. This was how it worked in their world. Plant the seed of doubt, water it with whispers, and watch as a woman's reputation strangled in the garden of public opinion. But this time, instead of shrinking away, instead of accepting the blow, Grace looked Constance directly in the eyes and smiled. "How interesting," she said slowly, "that you of all people would concern yourself with the question of faithfulness. Tell me, Mother Constance, do you think Pastor Goodwin would agree with these whispers? Should we perhaps ask him? He does visit so often." The color drained from Constance's face like water from a cracked bucket, and in that moment, both women understood that the war had officially begun. That night marked a turning point, because Constance wasn't stupid. She knew that Grace knew something, even if she wasn't sure exactly what or how much. And a cornered hypocrite is more dangerous than a wounded animal, because they have everything to lose and no moral ground to stand on. Grace started noticing things. The way Constance would appear in doorways unexpectedly, as if trying to catch Grace in some compromising position. The way she'd ask probing questions about where Grace had been, who she'd talked to, what she'd seen. Thomas remained oblivious, wrapped up in his own world of trade and business, but Samuel started to sense the tension. "Mother seems troubled," he mentioned one evening. "She keeps asking me if you've been acting strangely." Grace just smiled and placed his hand on her growing belly. "The only strange thing," she said, "is how much your mother seems to care about my daily movements. One might think she fears I'm keeping secrets." The message was clear: push me, and I'll push back. Meanwhile, Pastor Goodwin was becoming increasingly nervous. Grace noticed it in his sermons, which had taken on a frantic edge, full of warnings about bearing false witness and the punishment awaiting those who spread lies about the righteous. He'd pace the pulpit like a caged animal, his eyes darting to Constance and then away, as if he could barely stand to look at her but couldn't help himself. Grace wondered how long they'd been meeting secretly to discuss the problem of grace. She didn't have to wonder long, because one evening in late winter, about 6 months into her pregnancy, she witnessed their desperation firsthand. Unable to sleep because of the baby pressing on her lungs, Grace had wrapped herself in blankets and positioned herself by her window, looking out at the frozen landscape. And that's when she saw them, meeting not in the woods this time but in the church itself, probably thinking the late hour and brutal cold would keep any witnesses away. Grace moved carefully down the stairs, out into the night, and positioned herself beneath a window where she could hear their voices carried on the wind. What she heard made her blood run colder than the February air. "She knows," Constance was saying, her voice tight with panic. "I don't know how much, but she knows something. The way she looks at me, the things she says." Pastor Goodwin's response was chilling in its calculation. "Then we must act before she does. The woman has just given birth to no reason, no one will question it if we suggest she's suffering from birthing madness. It's common enough. And if she speaks against us while in such a state, her words will mean nothing." Constance's voice dropped lower. "And if birthing madness isn't enough?" There was a long pause, and then Pastor Goodwin spoke words that turned Grace's survival instinct into pure steel. "Then we must consider that Providence Falls has seen witches before. Strange accusations from a troubled woman, signs of demonic influence, the coincidence of finally conceiving after years of barrenness. The pieces would fit together easily enough." Grace stood in the freezing darkness, her hand protectively cradling her unborn child, and understood with perfect clarity that she was no longer playing a game of reputation and social standing. She was playing a game of survival. They were planning to either declare her mad or accuse her of witchcraft, and in Puritan Massachusetts, both paths led to the same destination, her complete destruction. Her word would mean nothing. Her truth would be called lies or the devil's work. They would take her child, possibly take her life, and Constance would stand there in the aftermath, shaking her head sadly about the tragedy of it all, secretly relieved that her threat had been eliminated. But here's the thing about being backed into a corner with no way out, it clarifies the mind wonderfully. Grace made her way back to her room, and for the first time since discovering the affair, she felt genuinely afraid. Not the social fear of humiliation or exile, but the primal fear of extinction. They had the power, the community's trust, and the willingness to destroy her. What did she have? A secret she couldn't prove. A pregnancy that gave her temporary value but would make her vulnerable during birth. And a name. She had the right to name her child. The thought came to her slowly, like dawn breaking over a dark horizon. In their world, mothers named their children. It was one of the few absolute powers a woman possessed. The father might suggest, the family might pressure, but tradition held that the woman who bore the child in pain had earned the right to give it identity. Grace's mind began working through the possibilities, through the weapon she'd been carrying all along without realizing it. A name was more than just sounds and syllables. A name was a statement. A name was a story. A name could be an accusation wrapped in innocence, a revelation disguised as honor. But she had to survive until the birth first. And that meant playing the most dangerous game of all, appearing weak while gathering strength, seeming compliant while planning rebellion, letting Constance and Pastor Goodwin think they'd won while she prepared her final move. Grace spent the remaining months of her pregnancy in careful performance. She attended church faithfully, her head bowed in apparent submission. She deferred to Constance on household matters, her voice soft and agreeable. She played the part of the grateful daughter-in-law, blessed by God with a child after years of waiting, humble and harmless and absolutely no threat to anyone at all. But every night, she lay in bed and ran through the plan. The baptism would be public, the entire village required to attend. The moment of naming would be ceremonial, formal, witnessed by everyone. And in that moment, with all eyes watching, with Constance and Pastor Goodwin confident in their victory, Grace would speak a name that would detonate like a powder keg in the center of their pious world. She didn't know yet if it would save her or damn her, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: the truth was going to come out, and hypocrisy was going to burn. The baby kicked inside her, strong and insistent, and Grace whispered to her unborn child in the darkness, "You're going to have a very important name, little one. A name that tells a story. A name that changes everything." Because sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sword or a gun. Sometimes it's just the courage to speak truth in a room full of liars, to name the sin everyone can see but no one will acknowledge, to be the woman who refuses to be silent even when silence is the only thing that might keep her safe. The question that haunted Grace through those final months wasn't whether she should use the weapon of naming. It was whether she'd survive long enough to use it at all. And whether speaking one true name could really bring down two people who'd spent years building walls of righteousness around their rot. Would justice triumph, or would the powerful simply crush another woman who dared to challenge them? Grace was about to find out, and Providence Falls would never be the same. The question that burned through Providence Falls on that March morning wasn't whether Grace would survive childbirth, but whether anyone would survive what came after. The labor started 3 days before the full moon, and it was brutal. Grace had heard the stories, of course. Every woman in the village had their horror tales about bringing life into the world, but hearing about pain and experiencing it are two different countries entirely. The contractions came like waves trying to break her in half, and through the haze of agony, Grace was acutely aware that Constance was the only one in the birthing chamber with her. Samuel paced outside, as men did, useless and anxious. The midwife had been called but hadn't arrived yet. And Constance stood over Grace with hands that had delivered dozens of babies but eyes that held something far more complicated than medical concern. In a moment when the pain receded just enough for Grace to think clearly, when she was drenched in sweat and trembling with exhaustion, she looked up at her mother-in-law and whispered 4 words that changed everything. "I know about Elijah." The room seemed to freeze despite the fire blazing in the hearth. Constance's hands, which had been pressing a cool cloth to Grace's forehead, went completely still. The color drained from the older woman's face as if someone had pulled a plug and let all the blood run out. Grace watched, understanding and terror war across Constance's features, and then she was gripped by another contraction that tore a scream from her throat. But through the pain, through the animal desperation of bringing a child into the world, Grace saw that the power had finally, irrevocably shifted. Constance knew that Grace knew. And there was nothing she could do about it. Not now. Not here. Not while Grace was about to become a mother. The baby arrived just after midnight, a girl, small but fierce, her cry cutting through the darkness like a knife through silk. The midwife had arrived in time to catch her, and Samuel was brought in to see his daughter, tears streaming down his face with the kind of joy that almost made Grace feel guilty for what she was about to do. Almost. Because as she held her daughter against her chest, feeling that tiny heartbeat against her own, she knew that this child deserved to grow up in a world where hypocrisy didn't reign, where powerful people couldn't destroy the powerless on a whim, where truth mattered more than reputation. The baptism was scheduled for the following Sunday, and those days between birth and ceremony moved like molasses, thick and slow and suffocating. Constance tried everything to convince Grace to name the baby after her. She brought gifts. She spoke about family tradition. She reminded Grace of all the support she'd given during the pregnancy, conveniently forgetting the 3 years of torture that came before. Samuel, unknowing and naive, thought it was a wonderful idea. "Mother would be so honored," he said, holding his daughter with the careful grip of a new father. "After everything she's done for us." Grace just smiled and said she was still deciding, still praying for guidance, still waiting for God to tell her the right name. What she didn't say was that God had already spoken, loud and clear, that frozen night in the woods when she'd witnessed righteousness revealing itself as rot. The morning of the baptism arrived with cruel perfection. The weather was beautiful, spring finally asserting itself after a brutal winter, the kind of day that made people feel like God was smiling down on Providence Falls. The entire village gathered in the meeting house, packed shoulder to shoulder, because a baptism was always an event, but this one carried extra weight. Grace Ashford, the woman they'd all written off as barren, blessed with a child at last. It was a redemption story they could all feel good about. Pastor Goodwin stood at the front in his finest robes, his Bible open, his face arranged in that expression of benevolent authority he wore so well. Constance sat in the front pew beside Thomas, her back straight, her prayer book in her lap, satisfaction radiating from her like heat from a stove. She thought she'd won. They all thought the story was over. Grace walked down the aisle carrying her daughter, wrapped in a christening gown that had been in the Ashford family for 3 generations, and she could feel every eye in the room tracking her movement. Samuel walked beside her, proud and oblivious. When they reached the front, Pastor Goodwin smiled at them with what looked like genuine warmth if you didn't know what Grace knew. "We gather today," he intoned in that voice that had commanded attention for years, "to welcome this child into our community and into God's grace. What name have you chosen for this blessed infant?" The room fell silent, waiting. Constance leaned forward slightly in her pew, anticipation written across her features. And Grace spoke clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of that crowded meeting house. "I named this child Elijah." The confusion was immediate and delicious. Whispers erupted like brushfire. Elijah was a man's name. Why would she name a girl Elijah? Samuel looked bewildered, turning to Grace with questions in his eyes. Constance had gone absolutely rigid, her face frozen in an expression somewhere between horror and rage. Pastor Goodwin stammered, something Grace had never heard him do before. "Surely you mean Eliza, or perhaps," but Grace cut him off, her voice steady as stone. No. I mean Elijah. I name her after the prophet Elijah, who exposed the false prophets and called down truth like fire from heaven. And I name her after Pastor Elijah Goodwin, whose counsel and presence have been so very frequent in our household these past years. She turned to look directly at Constance, her smile sharp as a blade. My mother-in-law has always spoken so highly of Pastor Goodwin's visits, of his wisdom, of his dedication. I thought it only fitting to honor the man she esteems above all others. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. You could see the understanding spreading through the congregation like ripples in a pond. Eyes turned to Constance, whose composure was cracking like ice in spring thaw. Eyes turned to Pastor Goodwin, whose guilt was written across his face for anyone who cared to read it. The village gossips, who'd spent years perfecting the art of reading between lines and seeing what wasn't being said, put the pieces together with the speed of long practice. Frequent visits. Above all others. The way Grace had emphasized certain words, the way she'd looked at Constance. And suddenly, everyone was remembering things they'd seen but not quite registered. The way Constance volunteered for every church duty. The way Pastor Goodwin's eyes would find her in crowds. The way they were always the last two people to leave evening services. Constance made the fatal error of standing up, of trying to defend herself before anyone had even accused her of anything. How dare you imply, this is outrageous, I have only ever, but the more she protested, the guiltier she sounded, and everyone in that room knew it. Pastor Goodwin tried to laugh it off, tried to say something about misunderstandings and the confusion of new motherhood, but his voice shook and his hands trembled, and in a village full of people trained to spot sin, those signs were as good as a signed confession. Grace held her daughter close and spoke one final time, her voice ringing with the kind of authority that comes from speaking absolute truth. In our community, we believe God sees all sins, both public and private. I have named my daughter Elijah so that she might always remember that righteousness cannot exist alongside hypocrisy, and that those who cast stones should first examine their own souls. Then she turned and walked out of that meeting house, leaving chaos in her wake, her daughter in her arms, her head held high for the first time in 3 years. What happened next moved with the brutal efficiency of an avalanche. The village elders called meetings. Questions were asked. Under pressure and faced with their own guilt, both Constance and Pastor Goodwin confessed. She was cast out of the Ashford household, forbidden from seeing her granddaughter. He was stripped of his position and marked with the brand reserved for adulterers. The village that had judged Grace so harshly turned its judgment elsewhere, and the foundation of their pious certainty cracked wide open. Samuel, humiliated but unable to deny the truth, stood by Grace because he had no choice and perhaps, deep down, because he knew she deserved his support. Grace became something both feared and respected, the woman who had spoken truth when it cost everything, who had used the only power available to her, who had refused to be silent even when silence might have kept her safe. She never gloated, never celebrated the destruction she'd caused. She simply raised her daughter Elijah, teaching her that a name could be a weapon, that truth mattered more than comfort, and that sometimes the only way to survive in a world built on hypocrisy was to burn it down and build something better in the ashes. Now here's what I want to know from you. If you had been Grace, trapped in a world where speaking up meant risking everything, where the powerful could destroy the powerless on a whim, would you have stayed silent to stay safe? Or would you have done exactly what she did, used the only weapon available, and spoken truth regardless of the cost? Drop your answer in the comments because this question matters just as much today as it did in 1683. And if this story made you think, if it made you feel something, hit that like button and subscribe because we've got more stories about people who refused to stay silent, who fought back against impossible odds, who proved that sometimes the smallest act of defiance can shake an entire world. The next story is even wilder, trust me. Until then, remember, the truth will set you free, but first it might just set everything on fire.